Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this e-learning webinar, Understanding Charity Fraud, created as part of International Charity Fraud Awareness Week. The week brings together everyone involved in the charity and not-for-profit sectors to raise awareness and share good practice in tackling fraud and financial crime. We encourage you to share this video and any of our other resources with your colleagues. My name is Alan Bryce. I'm the Head of Development, Counter-Fraud and Cybercrime at the Charity Commission for England and Wales. The first and arguably most important step is for charities to recognise and acknowledge that fraud now represents a significant risk. There is no agreed value for the loss caused by fraud to charities, but some research suggests that certainly we could be talking about hundreds of millions, if not potentially billions of pounds. Research also shows that there are some common charity risk factors that you need to be aware of and which should be addressed to minimise the risk of fraud. I'll talk about some of these in more detail later, but the most obvious ones I would want you to consider are sometimes excessive trust, a reluctance to challenge, and in some cases weak, inconsistent, or unfortunately the non-existence of internal controls to prevent or detect fraud at charities. That's why reviewing internal controls on a regular basis is critical. I would also encourage you to seek appropriate advice and guidance that is available. In particular, the Charity Commission webpage, Protect Your Charity from Fraud and Cybercrime, and also the Fraud Advisory Panel's Charity Fraud page, both of which provide useful information, guidance, and good practice that charities should adopt. So why does it matter? Well, fraud impacts on charities and the wider charity sector in a number of different ways. I've already talked about the national financial impact that fraud on charities can cause, but of course individual charities themselves have been hit by frauds and have unfortunately resulted in some charities even having to close. Of course, every pound lost to fraud is a pound that cannot be spent on a charitable service or to benefit directly the beneficiaries that the charity is involved with. That's the financial side, but there's also the reputational harm to individual charities when the fraud occurs, and more widely to the whole charity sector, undermining public trust and confidence. That's why charities need to take the right approach. Fraud happens, even to the best charities, the best public sector, and the best private sector organisations. It will occur. What matters is that charities have done all that they reasonably can to have prevented the fraud from occurring in the first place, and that they respond appropriately when the fraud has happened. I'll expand a little more on what I mean by that. There are some common types of charity fraud to be aware of, but many of the frauds I'm going to talk about are common across many different sectors, and they're not unique to just charities. One of the most common types that we're now dealing with is something called payment diversion fraud. A good example of this, and perhaps better known as mandate fraud or change of bank details fraud, is where the fraudster purports to be a legitimate organisation that the charity deals with, uses information in the public domain, perhaps from the internet and social media, and a technique called social engineering to get the trust of charities and individuals in charities, and encourages and makes the charities divert legitimate payments from a legitimate company to the bank account of the fraudster. And of course that money then is moved on by the fraudster. Another common type of fraud that we're now seeing is something called chief executive fraud. I'll give you an example of that in a moment, but just to assure you, this is not where the chief executive has committed fraud, but again, similar to payment diversion fraud, this is where the fraudster purports to be a senior officer of the charity, often again using social engineering skills and information in the public domain to convince charities to make payments that they would not otherwise do. Fundraising fraud. That's one of these areas of fraud that really is quite unique to the charity sector. And of course, this fraud can happen anywhere in the fundraising process. And increasingly, unfortunately, many online fundraising activities, disaster response collections that are online are being targeted by fraudsters. You need to be aware of the risk that monies that would otherwise go to your charity are being diverted to the fraudsters' bank accounts. Grant application fraud. That's why it's really important that charities, many of whom do give out grants in relation to their charitable activities, that when they deal with the people making applications for grants, that they undertake appropriate due diligence checks. And finally, insider fraud. There's a whole plethora of different types of insider fraud that can occur. Now, the vast majority of people, whether they are trustees, whether they are employees, or whether they are volunteers, all, of course, fundamentally honest. But people will try and exploit charities, and they will do so while working for or volunteering for those charities. In some cases, we've seen more than 90% of some of the fraud cases that individual charities have dealt with being internal in nature. The sorts of things that you might look at would be, say, expenses fraud, where there might be inflation of expense claims, or payroll or pensions fraud, very common right across the public and private sector as well, perhaps ghost employees on the payroll, and sometimes failure to disclose conflicts of interest, or sometimes then becomes abusive position fraud. This might be where, for example, say in the procurement process, a charity, an individual at the charity, doesn't disclose that they have an interest in an organization or a company that they could potentially give a contract to, and as a result of that, they may give that contract potentially by abusing their position to somebody where they have a financial or personal interest. And these are issues that charities should be constantly on the lookout for. So I said I would give you an example of a chief executive fraud, a type of fraud that unfortunately is increasingly common and for which charities can take some very simple but effective steps to prevent. In the particular case I'm thinking of, a finance director of a large charity was delivering a presentation to an international aid conference recently. That finance director's attendance at that conference was reported in advance on both the conference's website and the charity's own website, and even in the financial director's own personal social media. Therefore, that information about that director was in the public domain. On the day of the presentation itself, the charity received an email purporting to be from the finance director, which instructed the charity's finance team to immediately transfer £55,000 to a specific bank account. Allegedly, this was part of an urgent aid funding package agreed at the conference that day. The email itself was very convincing. It included genuine information about the finance director and the conference and the subject matter on which that finance director was speaking. It also suggested that the finance director had authorized the transfer itself. The charity itself transferred that £55,000 to what turned out to be a fake account run by fraudsters. Again, obviously, that email was subsequently found to be fraudulent, and unfortunately, the money was not recovered. And this, again, is a form of social engineering where charities will be targeted by fraudsters using information that's in the public domain. So what are some common enabling factors in charity fraud that you should be looking out for? Well, again, this is not in all cases of fraud that not just charities but any organization can suffer, but we have seen these time and time again as recurring themes in some of the, in fact, many of the cases of charity fraud that we are now dealing with. Often there might be a lack of supervision or oversight at the charity itself that would enable that fraud to occur or have prevented that fraud from being identified earlier. I've mentioned already the poor application or the non-existence of internal controls. The internal control framework is very important in terms of preventing fraud getting into the system in the first place. No segregation of duties or designated responsibility. Segregation of duties is a very difficult issue for many charities to deal with, especially if you're a small charity and have limited volunteers or staff that you can draw upon. And I recognize that. That's why a proportionate response has to be implemented. So if you can, yes, definitely put in place arrangements to maximize segregation of duties. But if you cannot, recognize that issue and take appropriate action to put other controls in place that address that risk. Poor financial controls. Financial controls are important not just to identify at an early stage when the fraud has occurred, but also subsequently, if there's an investigation and potentially a prosecution, to have evidence that would substantiate that a fraud has indeed occurred. Excessive trust. I alluded to this at the start. Excessive trust is one of the biggest issues that charities face. That might sound strange. Trust, after all, is fundamental to the way in which charities work. But excessive trust is something that fraudsters time and time again we are seeing are exploiting to defraud charities themselves. So in that aspect of professional skepticism is something I would encourage. And of course, lack of disciplinary action for previous frauds. You need some deterrence within the system. It's important in terms of the overall culture at a charity, that it can be seen by anybody involved with that charity and those outside the charity that your charity does take fraud seriously and will take action. Of course, the vast majority of frauds are never treated from a criminal perspective. Therefore, other forms of disciplinary action are important. But treat fraud as fraud. So how to fight fraud? Well, trustees should first of all accept that they have the principal responsibility to manage the risk of fraud. But of course, everyone has a part to play, not just trustees, and that includes staff, volunteers, and members of the public, if we want to make fraud much more difficult to occur against individual charities and our whole charity sector. It's really important that charities create a strong counter-fraud culture, sometimes referred to as a zero-tolerance approach to fraud. Is fraud talked about in an open and transparent way within your charity? I'm talking about the ways in which to identify the fraud risk before it happens. And of course, that strong application of financial controls. It's the consistent, robust application of very simple controls that makes the biggest difference in preventing fraud. And I'd say to you, encourage people to raise concerns. Individuals, volunteers, employees, and of course trustees have some of the best insights into where problems could potentially lie and which could be exploited by fraudsters within your charity. So if you have a concern, encourage people to report it. And finally, to finish off with, here's a few top tips that came out of a report published on the Fraud Advisory Panel website and arose from a national conference that the Fraud Advisory Panel and ourselves at the Charity Commission ran a couple of years ago. Now, I would say here is that the full information is available in the report, but some quick headline messages of real importance. Yes, act quickly. And of course, don't panic. This might seem obvious, but one of the best ways of doing that is having something called a fraud response plan in place. In effect, preparing the arrangements should a fraud occur, and of course fraud will almost certainly occur at some time in the charity's life, but should it occur, have something prepared in advance so you know how your charity is going to respond. There's lots of different ways to take action, and including some external guidance and of course internal guidance that you could draw upon from within your charity, including your internal audit team. And that's not to forget, make sure you report it. I don't just mean internally within your own charity, but also to the Charity Commission and to the police through the Action Fraud reporting arrangements. Thus, thank you very much for listening, and please remember to check out all the other free resources that have been created as part of the Charity Fraud Awareness Week. These are available on our online hub. Together, we can keep charity fraud out.